Hey guys, tonight we're diving into how the Vikings found relaxation after their legendary raids. After smashing through villages and possibly leaving a few too many beards and helmets behind, they had to wind down somehow. Because even Norse gods need a moment of peace, right? You're probably thinking, how could they possibly relax after a bloodthirsty raid? Well, as it turns out, their ways of easing back into life were just as intense as their battles, but with a lot more mead involved. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is as you listen. I'm curious to see where you're all tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. After a Viking raid, the chaos of battle slowly fades away. The adrenaline wanes, and the warriors are left to reflect on their actions, or at least that's what we'd like to imagine. But in reality, Vikings needed to find ways to unwind after all that frenzy. To truly understand how they relaxed, let's start with what may seem obvious: feasting. Yes, after days or even weeks of brutal raids, the Vikings found comfort in the best way possible by eating and drinking, of course. Picture this: you've just returned to your longhouse smelling faintly of salt blood and the open sea. You've conquered, you've pillaged, and now it's time for the reward. A lavish feast awaited you: meat, bread, cheese, and plenty of ale. Historians love to romanticize the Viking warrior, and while it's true that they often drank like fish or like men who just wanted to forget the feast, was a ritual of bonding and relaxing. The Viking feasts weren't just about the food. It was the social time, the stories, the camaraderie. You see, Vikings didn't just come back to grab a quick bite. No. They gathered in large groups sitting around the fire, and the night went on often for hours. The meals were rich, but it wasn't just the belly that got filled. The soul did too. There was something deeply restorative about being surrounded by comrades, letting the events of the raid fade away as the warmth of food and drink took over. The alcohol, particularly mead, was the star of the show, though. Mead wasn't just a drink for the Vikings. It was sacred. To them, mead was the drink of the gods, Odin's own nectar, if you will. And just like everything else in Viking life, it wasn't consumed lightly. Mead was passed around, sipped slowly, and sometimes even offered to the gods as a gesture of gratitude for survival. Drinking and storytelling were intricately intertwined, like a soft lullaby for battle-worn men. Historians still argue whether the Vikings drank to forget their deeds or to celebrate them. But what's clear is that mead provided the perfect environment for the kind of relaxed storytelling they were known for. And of course, you'd never want to miss the opportunity to tell a story of your own. The drunker you got, the better your tale sounded, and the more your fellow Vikings would listen. One Viking, let's call him Ragnar, because why not might have stood up, raised his cup, and declared, "I slew a beast so large that it would have swallowed you whole and still have room for the next one." Then, of course, Ragnar's fellow warriors would embellish the tale, arguing over how the beast was really killed, until they were all laughing and shouting. A few more meads later, and the beast might have been a fire-breathing dragon, which honestly doesn't sound too bad as a recovery tactic after a raid. But it wasn't all about the food and drink. For the Viking warrior rest also meant peace of mind, something hard to come by after seeing the destruction they left behind. Some of them might have stolen a few quiet moments away from the clamor of their comrades. They didn't go off to some magical forest retreat, but they did take refuge in a brief solitude. While their comrades filled their bellies and yelled stories into the night, a few of them would slip away into the shadows, maybe just for a short while to let the day's noise slip away. Historians suggest that retreating to their own thoughts could be a powerful way to reset something that may have seemed odd to outsiders, but likely gave these hardened men the rest they needed to face another battle. Some would go as far as taking the time to care for themselves physically. A Viking warrior wasn't always carrying a sword or shield. In his downtime, you might have found him trimming his beard or polishing his armor. Small, soothing tasks like this helped them return to their centered selves, mentally prepared for what lay ahead. And no, it wasn't about vanity. It was a way to reclaim control, if only for a few moments. It also might have been their form of a brief meditative ritual, much like how you or I might mindlessly organize a drawer after a stressful day. In all this, the Vikings didn't abandon their warrior spirit. They just took the time to nourish what needed repairing. When they were done, and their bellies were full, they could sit back, let their minds wander, and let the shadows of battle slip away until the next raid came calling. Now that our Viking warriors are fed mead in hand, and their bodies have had a moment to rest, let's dive into one of the most vital elements of their unwinding gathering around the fire. After all, there's no better way to ease into relaxation than with the soft, flickering glow of a fire. The hearth wasn't just for cooking. It was, in fact, the heart of the Viking home, a place where both physical warmth and emotional comfort were found. If you think about it, there's something deeply satisfying about the crackle of a fire, especially after a long, exhausting day of looting and pillaging. The fire was central to Viking life in more ways than you might expect. It wasn't just an aesthetic, it was the lifeblood of the home. Picture yourself in that longhouse, the thick wooden beams of the ceiling, creating a sense of shelter from the wild world outside. The heat from the fire wrapped around you, the light casting long dancing shadows across the walls. Everyone gathered close. Neighbors, friends, family, even the occasional guest, each with their own stories to share. For the Vikings, the fire wasn't just a source of warmth, it was a gathering point, a place where you could rest your muscles and share your experiences with others. But here's where it gets interesting. The Viking fire was also where storytelling came to life. And I mean real storytelling woven with humor exaggeration and an odd mixture of boldness and humility. The fire would have been the stage for what we know as the skaldic tradition. Skalds were like the ancient Norse version of bards or poets. These individuals were skilled in the art of storytelling, but they didn't just tell any old tale. Oh no, they would embellish and glorify everything from battles to gods, sometimes so wildly that the listener would leave believing a single Viking could take on an entire army of monsters. Historians debate whether this was more of an artistic tradition or a way to pass the time. But either way, it certainly helped the warriors let off some steam. The Vikings weren't always as stoic and serious as popular media often portrays them. In fact, many would have cracked jokes while telling stories. Picture one Viking making an absurd claim about how his axe was so sharp that it could cut the wind itself, while the rest of the group snorted with laughter. It wasn't just about bragging rights, it was about bonding. The Vikings needed that camaraderie after their raids. They needed to sit together, share a laugh, and remember that life wasn't just about violence and conquest. Some skalds would even compose songs during these fires, glorifying warriors' deeds with all the appropriate pomp. But, curiously, these songs weren't just about the successful raids. They often included personal stories, sometimes recounting failures, awkward moments, or feelings of homesickness. Historians argue whether the Vikings were just trying to create a sense of shared humanity in the aftermath of violence, or whether they truly believed that singing about these personal tales would appease the gods. Either way, these sessions around the fire had a magical quality that helped warriors transition from bloodthirsty raiders to peaceful dreamers. There was also the healing power of the fire, the psychological comfort it offered. Sitting by the hearth with the warmth wrapping around you like a cozy blanket, you might have found that the troubles of the day began to dissolve, even if only for a little while. The glow of the fire was like a small bubble of safety in an otherwise chaotic world. As one historian put it, the Viking fire was both the source of light and the place where the darkness of the world was kept at bay. It was no wonder that Vikings found peace in the simple act of sitting by the fire, listening to tales and sipping on their mead. On the more practical side, fire also played a role in healing physical wounds. After a raid, when the warriors returned to the longhouse with their bruises, cuts, and occasionally broken bones, the fire helped soothe these injuries. Warmth from the hearth had long been recognized as a natural way to relax tight muscles and ease aching limbs. However, not every Viking spent their time laughing and drinking after a raid. Some sought a little more quiet reflection. While the fire was often the center of action, there were plenty of Vikings who preferred to sit in the back, letting their comrades entertain themselves while they quietly watched the flames. This wasn't about isolation. It was about finding peace within the chaos, taking a moment to reflect on what had just happened, and quietly resetting their mind. After all, they'd been through a lot. Historians still argue whether the Vikings were as social as we tend to think they were. Did the longhouses really echo with laughter, or were there moments of quiet contemplation too? Some scholars believe the quiet retreat to the back of the hall was just as important for personal restoration as the storytelling was for the group. So, while the Vikings may have been famously fierce, it seems they were equally adept at finding solace in the small moments, whether through shared stories, the warmth of the fire, or those brief introspective moments away from the chaos. So, next time you picture a Viking, don't just think of him with an axe in hand charging into battle. Picture him by the fire, the crackle of wood in the background, a glass of mead in hand, and perhaps a soft chuckle escaping from his lips as he listens to a ridiculous story about someone's ill-fated attempt to challenge a bear to a fight. Now, that's the side of the Vikings most people don't get to see. Now that we've seen how Vikings used fire to ease their minds and bond over stories, let's take a deeper look at something even more essential to their relaxation, the art of music and dance. Yes, I know you're probably imagining the Vikings as the ultimate tough guys, but trust me, when it came to unwinding, they definitely had their softer sides, and music was a big part of it. It wasn't just the warriors' swords and shields that made noise. They could sing and dance their way to relaxation too. Think about it after weeks on a long voyage, plundering villages and dodging arrows. There had to be some release from the tension of battle. And what better way to shake off the weight of a fight than with the rhythm of a drum and the echo of a voice? The Vikings weren't strangers to rhythmic beats. In fact, their music was not just a form of expression, but also a form of therapy. While you might picture the Viking longhouse filled with laughter and tales of glory, you might also find it resonating with the sounds of simple instruments like the lyre, the flute, or the drum. The rhythm would have soothed their battle-hardened nerves and allowed them to return to a more peaceful state of mind. Historians still debate how much of Viking music was about healing and how much was about performance. It's believed that dancing was also an integral part of their unwinding routine. Vikings were known to enjoy lively dances that involved lots of energy and movement, perhaps something that let them shake off the residue of the violence they had experienced. After a brutal raid, a lively circle dance might have been just what they needed to get their blood flowing again, but in a way that wasn't about fighting. It was about unburdening themselves, about tapping into that primal energy, but in a way that was fun, carefree, and full of joy. But don't get it twisted. This wasn't about graceful ballet. No, this was more of a primitive, exuberant dance full of stomping feet and swinging arms, a way to express strength and joy at the same time. The rhythms of these dances likely helped release pent-up aggression and tension, leaving the Vikings feeling lighter and more relaxed. Maybe it wasn't all about war. Maybe the Vikings could be playful too. The Viking bard, or skald, would often accompany the dancers with songs that told stories of gods, heroes, and far-off lands. The tunes were not always slow or soft. Sometimes they were fast and upbeat, echoing the battle cries that once filled the air. It's said that these bards could create songs on the spot, saying something truly Viking about how a man could fight, and then immediately entertain the room with his poetic talents. You have to wonder, was the rhythm of the music a way to recapture the energy of the battle, and then just as quickly turn it into a fun celebration? Or was it just an attempt to lighten the mood after a hard day's work? But here's the kicker. These songs and dances weren't just for fun. They were also ceremonial. Historians suggest that dance and music were used to honor the gods, not just to relax. The Vikings didn't only dance to forget their troubles. Sometimes they danced to thank the gods for their safety during raids, or to appease them before setting out on another journey. The rhythms of the dance, paired with the vibrations of the music, were believed to be a way to communicate with the divine. Music wasn't just a recreational activity. It was a sacred act, a prayer in motion. So imagine it, after a victorious raid, you're sitting by the fire with your comrade's mead in hand when the skald stands up and starts singing. The lyrics in their old Norse language might have spoken of the god Thor's great battles, or Odin's wisdom, their words full of grand imagery. As the skald sings, the dancers gather and begin to sway their movements, reflecting the god's battles. this was more than just leisure. This was a deep connection to their world. Historians still argue whether Vikings truly believed in this divine connection through music and dance, or if it was simply part of the cultural fabric. Either way, the communal nature of these sessions is undeniable. The music, the dancing, the storytelling, it all came together in a way that created a collective spirit. Even a Viking warrior known for his fierce nature would have been swept up in the moment, feeling a connection to something larger than himself, something beyond the bloody raids. And let's be honest here, folks. If you've ever danced around a fire with your friends to music that's made the night feel alive, you know the sense of calm that comes afterward. The tension melts away and the laughter comes easily. The Vikings, despite their fearsome reputations, were no different. When the music played and the dancing began, it was a reminder that there was more to life than battle. That, my friends, was how the Vikings truly relaxed after a raid. As we continue to explore the Viking path to relaxation, let's shift gears a little. We've seen how they came together for feasts, firelit storytelling, and even wild dances. But now we need to explore another very important aspect of their unwinding time: the role of bards and skalds in calming warriors and providing a form of spiritual respite. The Vikings weren't just about cutting down enemies. They were also poets, and their poets had a way of soothing the savage soul. Imagine a night after a raid. You've eaten well, shared your stories, and danced around the fire. But now, as the embers burn low and the laughter fades, it's time for something a little deeper. This is where the skalds, the Viking bards, step in. These men, or occasionally women though much less commonly, were not only the chroniclers of Viking deeds, but they were the emotional anchors of the group. While many warriors might have been adept at wielding weapons, it was the skalds who wielded words in a way that could shape the minds and emotions of the entire tribe. The skalds weren't just entertainers. They were storytellers with the power to turn a battle into an epic, a raid into a saga. Historians have long debated whether their role was strictly entertainment or whether it went beyond that, tapping into something more profound healing. By weaving songs and tales about gods, nature, and heroic deeds, skalds had the unique ability to pull warriors out of the physical and emotional weight of battle. The skalds' songs had a rhythm to them, almost like a mantra. With every verse, they slowly carried the listener away from the harshness of the raid and into a place of peace. A Viking could sit back, listen, and let the grandeur of the story wash over him like a cool breeze on a hot day. Picture this. The skald stands tall, his voice steady and clear, weaving tales of Odin's wisdom, Thor's thunderous hammer, and the warriors who had gone before them. The rhythms of the words, the cadence would have a soothing quality, allowing warriors to detach themselves from their own troubles. It's said that many Vikings used the stories of the gods as a way of reconnecting with their purpose. If Thor could stand tall and fight giants, surely I can overcome the challenges of this raid, a warrior might think. Through these songs, the Viking warrior could gain strength from the divine, and in doing so release some of the tension that came from the battle. But here's the real kicker. Viking poetry wasn't just about telling tales of gods and heroes. the skalds also had a knack for capturing the personal experiences of the warriors themselves. They would sing songs about the bravery, the mistakes, the misadventures, essentially. They turned the everyday experiences of the Viking life into legendary tales. Historians still argue whether the Vikings truly believed in the gods as deeply as they claimed, or if the mythology was more about cultural pride. Either way, the way these stories made the warriors feel was just as important as the tales themselves. It wasn't about belief as much as it was about connection. Connection to each other, to the past, and to the future. Skalds often sang about moments of personal vulnerability of warriors who failed, but found a way to rise again. This might have been the Vikings' version of what we now call mental health support. Warriors who had suffered emotional trauma or were struggling to come to terms with their actions in battle could listen to these songs and feel that they were not alone. It's likely that the act of singing these songs helped the Viking warriors process their experiences, whether they were deeply traumatic or not. It was a collective form of therapy, one that brought the group together while allowing each individual to process their own feelings. But let's not forget, while the skalds were soothing the warriors' minds, they were also reminding them of honor and duty. The stories didn't just focus on bravery and triumph. Many of the tales were deeply reflective, reminding warriors of the high price of failure, the cost of dishonor, and the value of sacrifice. But this wasn't about guilt or shame. It was more about understanding the balance. Warriors who'd spent months or years in foreign lands could find comfort in the idea that their struggles weren't unique, that their failures could be redeemed in the eyes of the gods, just as the heroes of old had redeemed themselves in the ancient stories. Historians still argue over whether the Viking skalds were as revered as the warriors they sang about. Were the skalds truly a bridge between the gods and men? Did they hold a spiritual authority over the warriors, guiding them through their toughest moments? The question remains, but one thing is certain. The songs had power. The skalds weren't just entertainers. They were guides who helped the Vikings manage the emotional turbulence of their violent lives. The songs brought the warriors back to a centered state, ready to face the world again, whether it be the challenges of the next raid or the quieter task of surviving the winter. The power of the Viking bardic tradition was as much about healing as it was about entertainment. So next time you picture the Vikings with their fierce swords and angry gods, remember that they had their moments of deep reflection too. They had their skalds, those ancient storytellers who helped them transform the chaos of their lives into something more manageable, into something meaningful. And in that quiet healing, they found the strength to face another day, another battle, another raid. As we move forward into the Viking warrior's quest for relaxation, let's pause for a moment to explore something a little unexpected. The moments of solitude that many Vikings sought after a raid. Yes, even though they were notorious for their rowdy, boisterous social scenes, there were times when the Viking warrior needed to step back from it all and find a moment of quiet. But it wasn't just any kind of solitude. These quiet moments were crucial for their mental recovery, as vital as a night of feasting or dancing. Imagine it after a long and grueling raid, where the air was thick with the scent of salt and blood. The hustle and bustle of the longhouse must have felt overwhelming. The laughter of fellow warriors, the clinking of med-filled mugs, the stories that bounced off the walls. Sometimes it was all just too much. For some, the solution wasn't more celebration. It was withdrawal. No, this wasn't about retreating out of shame or exhaustion, but rather about finding balance. The Vikings had a unique relationship with solitude. While modern society tends to view alone time as a negative or lonely experience for the Vikings, it was a way of resetting their minds after the chaos of battle. Historians often debate whether these solitary moments were a result of personal preference or cultural practice. Some scholars argue that the Vikings, with their warrior ethos, were inclined to embrace reflection and self-reliance, while others suggest that these solitary moments could have been driven by the demanding nature of the raids, where a person might need space to process everything they had just gone through. Whatever the reason, this form of quiet recovery was a deeply personal way for many Vikings to reset before diving back into the social whirlpool of Viking life. But how did they spend these solitary moments? Well, contrary to popular belief, they weren't necessarily off in some quiet corner doing nothing. Vikings didn't have the luxury of sitting in silence or gazing out at the horizon for hours on end. No, they found their peace in simple tasks. Tasks that didn't require much mental strain but still provided a soothing rhythm to their lives. Some would retreat to their personal space within the longhouse and engage in personal grooming, perhaps trimming their beard or cleaning their weapons. For others, it was about carving small wooden figures, intricate patterns, or personal totems. These tasks were surprisingly meditative, offering a way to reset and process the chaos without diving back into it immediately. This wasn't some sort of lonely introspection either. In fact, many Viking warriors likely took comfort in the quiet solitude of their familiar surroundings, the place where they felt most at home. Their longhouses were crafted with purpose and designed to foster a sense of safety and belonging. For the Vikings, this moment of isolation wasn't about escaping from their culture or their people. It was about gathering strength to return to it. Here's a fun fact that might surprise you: the Vikings' relationship with nature played a huge role in their moments of peace. It wasn't unusual for a Viking to retreat outside the longhouse and find solace in the vast northern landscapes. The Vikings didn't see nature as something to conquer as we often picture them doing. Instead, they found peace in it. For them, the wilds weren't a place of violence, they were a sanctuary. So many Viking warriors would spend their quiet moments walking through the forests, feeling the cool breeze, listening to the rustling of the trees, and simply being still. Historians still argue whether the Viking need for solitude was truly a spiritual experience, or whether it was more about mental survival after the brutality of battle. Regardless of the reason, we can safely say that these quiet moments were crucial to the Vikings' ability to reset. After the adrenaline of a raid, they needed time to decompress, to gather their thoughts, and to heal not just physically, but emotionally. Interestingly, this need for personal space was balanced by the communal living of Viking society. You see, even though these warriors might have taken their personal time for reflection, the culture they lived in required constant social engagement. The longhouse was the epicenter of Viking life, where everyone from the warriors to the children gathered for meals, for stories, for songs, and for companionship. The juxtaposition of solitude and socialization was key to maintaining their mental equilibrium. The social structure of the Vikings demanded that they be both team players and independent thinkers. Without moments of solitude, the group dynamic would have surely become too overwhelming, especially for the warriors who had seen more than their fair share of bloodshed. While we might think of the Vikings as rugged loners, the truth is that their ability to balance independence and connection was one of the key factors that helped them survive the grueling raids and chaotic aftermath. After all, it wasn't just about being a fierce fighter, it was about being able to switch gears to go from warrior to peaceful soul, and to find the time and space for both. So next time you picture a Viking, don't just see him as a savage barbarian raiding for gold. Imagine him taking a moment of quiet reflection alone with his thoughts, maybe carving a little figure, or simply gazing out at the forest, finding his center before returning to his people. That's how they truly relaxed, by reconnecting with themselves and the natural world around them. Now that we've covered the Viking warrior's solitary retreat, let's dive into something that might catch you off guard: the healing power of sleep. Yes, you heard that right. Sleep wasn't just a necessary evil for the Vikings. It was an important part of their recovery process after a raid. But the Vikings didn't just close their eyes and drift off like we do after a long day of work or school. Sleep for them was almost sacred, a vital part of maintaining their strength and resilience. They knew that to keep up with the brutal pace of their raids, they had to give their bodies the time it needed to heal physically and mentally. Let's set the scene. After the battle's over, you've eaten your fill, enjoyed some light-hearted banter with your comrades, and even taken a moment to be alone with your thoughts. The longhouse is now quieting down, and the sounds of laughter fade away as warriors find their sleeping spots. The air is cooler now, the fire dimming to a soft glow, and the weight of the day begins to settle. This is where the real recovery begins. Vikings didn't just sleep for the sake of it. They prized rest as a way to restore their vitality. After all, it wasn't just about sleep itself. It was about deep restorative rest that allowed the body to heal and the mind to settle. Historians still argue about how the Vikings approached sleep. Was it a quick nap between raids, or was there a more intentional practice surrounding it? Some suggest that the Vikings were particularly attuned to the natural rhythms of the day and night. They didn't have clocks ticking away the minutes, but they had their own way of syncing with the world around them. Their daily lives were often governed by the rising and setting of the sun. When night came, it was a signal to rest, to rejuvenate. It wasn't simply a matter of exhaustion. It was a time to recharge and get ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Interestingly, the Vikings were known to practice a form of sleep hygiene that might seem surprisingly modern. They didn't sleep on just any surface, no. Their beds were specially crafted to ensure a good night's rest. Most Vikings slept on simple straw-filled mattresses, which might sound a little uncomfortable by today's standards, but these were actually quite effective. The straw was used for insulation, and Vikings would often cover themselves with animal furs for warmth. This combination of natural materials helped to keep them cozy on cold nights, and surprisingly, it might have also contributed to better sleep quality, by promoting warmth and comfort. But the Viking approach to sleep wasn't just about the body. They also believed that the dream world played a crucial role in healing and gaining insight. Some Viking warriors believed that Odin himself guided their dreams. Odin, the All-Father, was known to send dreams that would help warriors find the courage they needed, or give them insight into their next raid. Dreams were seen as a form of divine communication, where visions and messages could be delivered in the quiet of the night. Historians still debate how much the Vikings believed in these dream visions, but it's clear that they valued sleep not just for rest, but for its ability to provide spiritual clarity and guidance. Now, you might be wondering, did Vikings really get good sleep after the chaos of battle? After all their lives were filled with peril, and the emotional toll of violence would surely affect their rest. Well, interestingly, there's evidence to suggest that the Vikings were remarkably resilient when it came to sleep. They may have lived hard, but they knew how to take care of themselves when it came to rest. Some historians believe that sleeping deeply allowed the body to repair muscles, clear out toxins, and strengthen the immune system, ensuring the warriors were ready for the next day of battle or travel. So, in a way, their sleep habits were just as tactical as their warfare strategies. That said, Viking sleep wasn't just about the individual. They often slept in close quarters with one another in the longhouse with little personal space between them. This might sound uncomfortable to us, but it was actually socially bonding. Many Vikings took comfort in the presence of their comrades, especially after a long raid. The proximity might have offered a sense of security, a shared warmth against the cold, the assurance that you weren't alone in the world. As we look deeper into Viking sleep, one thing is clear: despite the brutality of their raids, the Vikings knew the importance of recovery. They didn't just crash out at the end of a long day. They understood the need to rest, rejuvenate, and reset both physically and mentally. In this respect, they were ahead of their time, practicing forms of self-care and mindfulness that we often associate with modern wellness routines today. Of course, there were probably some Vikings who didn't sleep well, just like there are today. Some might have had nightmares or troubling dreams, especially after a particularly grueling raid. But overall, sleep was a cornerstone of Viking life, a way for them to recover and prepare for whatever came next. Whether it was a dream about Odin's wisdom, or a night spent tucked under layers of furs, sleep was their quiet partner in battle, a vital element in their survival. And who knows? Maybe after a particularly rough raid, when the longhouse was quiet and the fire had burned low, you could find yourself drifting off to sleep with a final thought about the day's victories and the rest ahead. It's not so different from how we find comfort today. Sometimes all we need is a little rest to set the world right again. Now that we've explored the crucial role of sleep in the Vikings' recovery, let's turn our attention to a different but equally important aspect of their relaxation, communing with nature. Yes, in the midst of all the chaos and violence, the Vikings had a deep and abiding connection to the world around them. They didn't just raid, fight, and conquer. They also found peace and solace in the wild landscapes that surrounded their homes. Nature wasn't just a place to conquer or find resources. It was a source of healing, a place where the Viking warriors could truly reset and reconnect with themselves. The Viking world was harsh, especially in the northern reaches of Europe, where the long winters and short summers made survival a constant challenge. But paradoxically, it was in the wild, untamed landscapes of the forests, rivers, and mountains that many Vikings found their peace. This connection to nature wasn't just about hunting or gathering resources. It was a spiritual relationship, a bond that went beyond the material. Historians suggest that many Viking warriors viewed nature as both a temple and a therapist, a place where they could find clarity, stillness, and spiritual guidance. You see, while Viking raids and battles were intense and often violent, the natural world provided a much-needed balance. After a hard-fought raid, a Viking warrior might find himself wandering into the dense forests surrounding his village. The cool, damp air would carry the scent of pine and earth, and as the trees swayed in the wind, the warrior would feel the last vestiges of battle slip away. Some historians believe this ritual of walking through nature after a raid wasn't just for physical recovery, but also to allow the warrior to process the violence he had just experienced. By immersing himself in the forest or by a riverbank, the warrior could separate himself from the raw emotions of battle and return to a state of inner balance. The Vikings were deeply connected to the land, and they believed that nature was not just a passive backdrop for their lives. It was an active participant in their spiritual and mental well-being. In fact, many Viking gods and spirits were associated with natural elements. Thor, the god of thunder, was tied to the storms, the rain, and the fertility of the earth. Freya, the goddess of love and war, was linked to the fields and forests. By spending time in nature, the Vikings weren't just recovering from battle, they were also reconnecting with their gods and spirits. Historians still debate how religion and nature intersected for the Vikings. Was it a purely pragmatic connection using nature's resources for survival, or was there a spiritual element at play? Many scholars suggest that the Vikings didn't just see nature as a provider. They saw it as a living entity worthy of respect and reverence, whether it was a quiet walk by a river, a long trek through the snow-covered hills, or simply sitting by a campfire with a view of the stars. Nature was a spiritual sanctuary for Vikings who needed to step away from the violence of their daily lives. It was a place of restoration that helped them reflect, calm their minds, and reconnect with what mattered most. Interestingly, Viking warriors also believed that nature could provide them with guidance. After a successful raid or a victory in battle, a Viking might look for signs in the sky or the earth. Maybe a bird's flight pattern or the direction of the wind, believing that these signs were messages from the gods. It wasn't uncommon for a Viking to feel that his actions were inspired by nature, as though the world itself had directed him toward his fate. In this sense, nature wasn't just a physical experience. It was a psychological and spiritual one as well. Beyond spirituality, nature also had a more practical role in Viking relaxation. After long raids where fatigue and tension were high, the Viking warrior might retreat to a river or a lake to wash off the grime of battle. The cool, fresh water would provide a relieving sensation to tired muscles, and the peaceful surroundings would help the warrior center himself once again. It wasn't just about washing away dirt, it was about washing away the psychological weight of violence. This practice was a form of mental cleansing, allowing the Vikings to let go of the emotions they carried with them and return to their families as peaceful men. For those who didn't venture far from home, the Viking gardens were another natural retreat. Vikings were surprisingly skilled gardeners, and their homes often featured lush herb gardens, fruit trees, and flowers. These gardens weren't just for beauty, they served practical purposes too. The plants were used for healing remedies, cooking, and even rituals. Some Viking warriors found peace in tending to their gardens, after a raid watching their crops grow as a way to ground themselves and reconnect with life. The act of planting and caring for plants was a form of meditation, a chance to care for something other than their weapons and armor. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' connection to nature was as spiritual as they claimed, or whether it was more about practical survival. But no matter the reason, there's no denying that nature was a central part of their post-raid recovery. In the end, the Vikings understood something fundamental to survive the harshness of battle you needed to take time to recover. And nature in all its forms was a key element in that recovery. So, the next time you think of the Vikings, don't just picture them wielding axes and conquering lands. Imagine them taking a quiet walk through the forest, listening to the wind whisper through the trees, their thoughts drifting away from the noise of battle. That, too, was part of the Viking way of finding peace, a way of healing the mind and spirit. Now that we've explored the Vikings' connection to nature, let's turn our attention to something a little more personal, and dare I say soothing, the art of crafting. Yes, while the Vikings were known for their warrior ways, they weren't all about battles and raids. Many of them were incredibly skilled artisans, and I'm not just talking about their famous longships or axes. When they weren't plundering and conquering, Vikings spent time creating intricate, beautiful items that brought a surprising sense of calm to their otherwise turbulent lives. For the Vikings, crafting wasn't just about functionality. It was also about creativity, a form of expression and relaxation that helped them unwind after the intensity of battle. Imagine yourself back in the Viking longhouse after a raid. You've enjoyed a hearty feast, shared a laugh with your comrades, and even spent some time in solitude. Now the fire is flickering gently in the background, and it's time to find a way to occupy your mind in a less chaotic manner. What do? You might turn to your hands and the materials around you, whether it's wood, leather, or bone. Vikings were skilled in carving, weaving, and making pottery, all forms of creative release that offered a break from the violence of their lives. Many warriors might have crafted personal totems or carved runes, symbols that held meaning for them. These acts weren't just about making something functional. They were about the meditative act of creation, the slow, calming process of transforming raw materials into something meaningful. And the best part, these items often had personal significance, whether it was a carved figure to protect them in battle or a set of runes to invoke blessings from the gods. It wasn't about making money or showing off. It was about finding inner peace through the simple act of creation. Historians still debate how much of Viking crafting was tied to spirituality versus practicality. Some argue that crafting was a way to preserve tradition, passing down sacred knowledge through generations. Others believe it was simply a way to fill the hours during long winters when the raids were few and far between. Regardless of the reason, what's clear is that crafting served as a form of relaxation and personal expression. Whether they were carving intricate designs into their shields or weaving a new cloak, these acts allowed Vikings to center themselves, to disconnect from the violence of their daily lives and create something with their own hands. The Vikings didn't just craft for the sake of it. They crafted with purpose. Each piece had a story behind it. It was common for warriors to carry their personal creations, perhaps a carved pendant or a crafted shield, into battle. It wasn't just about protection. It was about the connection they felt to their craftsmanship, a way to carry their inner peace with them as they faced the chaos of war. But when the battle was over, these creations served as a reminder of calmer times, a moment of reflection after the chaos. The act of holding or using something they made with their own hands could provide a sense of continuity and stability after the turbulence of a raid. And if you think crafting was just for warriors, think again. Many Viking women were highly skilled weavers and textile artisans. They would spend hours crafting beautiful garments, including intricately designed tunics and woolen cloaks. It wasn't just about making something functional. These garments often featured intricate patterns and colorful dyes, making them a form of artistic expression. Historians suggest that for Viking women, the act of weaving or sewing could have been a way to relax and meditate during quieter times, creating something beautiful out of the mundane. One thing's for certain, Viking crafting was a much-needed outlet for creativity and relaxation. It was a form of self-care, an opportunity to slow down, focus on the details, and let go of the chaos of battle. Whether it was carving runes, weaving garments, or creating something as simple as a carved figure for luck, these crafts allowed Vikings to process their experiences in a peaceful way. They didn't just survive life's battles, they created beauty, they crafted memories, and they found solace in the act of creation. Now, I'm not saying you should run off and start carving runes tomorrow, though. Feel free if you're feeling adventurous. But next time you sit down to relax, think about the Vikings and their connection to their craft. The next time you're in need of a little relaxation, take a moment to create something, anything really. Whether it's writing, drawing, or even just assembling a puzzle, the act of crafting gives us a chance to focus our energy into something productive, and at the same time lets us disconnect from the noise of the world around us. So, whether you're carving a tiny figure, or just enjoying the simple act of creating something with your hands, remember the Vikings. They weren't just fierce warriors, they were artists too, and they found peace in the act of creation. As we continue our exploration of how the Vikings relaxed, let's dive into a fascinating but often overlooked aspect of their post-raid rituals: the healing power of herbs and remedies. Yes, while they were notorious for their axe-wielding and long-ship navigation, the Vikings had a surprisingly advanced understanding of natural remedies. The Vikings knew that after a raid, their bodies needed more than just rest and food. They needed healing, and nature provided the perfect medicine. Now, you may be thinking, herbal remedies. Were they really that advanced? Well, believe it or not, Vikings were practical, resourceful, and surprisingly skilled in using plants and herbs for various ailments, whether it was a sore muscle from an intense battle or an upset stomach. After a hearty meal, the Vikings had a variety of natural solutions at their disposal, and while they didn't have pharmacies or modern medicine, they had something perhaps even more valuable, the power of local nature-based healing. Picture yourself back in the Viking longhouse after a battle. You're sore, your muscles ache, and you're just a little bit run down. What do? For many Vikings, the answer was simple reach for a herb or plant. These warriors weren't just raiders. They were deeply connected to their environment. Herbal remedies were often a staple of Viking life, especially in the aftermath of raids. Vikings had learned to use wild plants to treat injuries, wounds, and illnesses, passing down knowledge of these remedies through generations. And, while they might have relied on the help of their fellow warriors for emotional support, these herbs were their trusted physical healers. Historians suggest that the Vikings were highly knowledgeable about the medicinal properties of plants. They used herbs like yarrow and nettle to treat wounds and stop bleeding. Yarrow, in particular, was a favorite of Viking healers, as it was known to reduce inflammation and promote healing. After a long battle or raid, these natural remedies were as important as any sword or shield. They provided relief and a sense of comfort amidst the chaos. While we tend to think of medicine today as something complicated, the Vikings had a more holistic approach to healing, grounded in the earth and the plants that grew around them. But the Vikings didn't just use herbs for physical injuries. They also relied on the power of herbs to calm their minds after the stresses of battle. Lavender and chamomile, both well known today for their calming properties, were part of the Viking herb repertoire. Imagine lying down on your straw mattress, the soft scent of lavender wafting through the air as you drift off to sleep. The Vikings, just like us, understood that mental healing was just as important as physical recovery. While modern medicine may offer us pills and treatments, the Vikings had nature's remedies, a soothing balm for both body and mind. Historians still debate how widespread the use of these herbs was in Viking society. Some argue that healing was the domain of the shamans or wise women, the ones who had deep knowledge of nature's powers. Others suggest that every Viking, from warriors to farmers, had a basic understanding of which herbs could treat what ailments. Regardless of the details, one thing is clear: herbal healing was a key part of the Viking lifestyle. It was their form of self-care, ensuring that they stayed strong and healthy in a world that was anything but gentle. Interestingly, the Vikings weren't just looking for instant relief. They also used herbs for long-term health. For example, garlic was a staple in Viking kitchens, not just for flavor, but for its antibacterial properties. Garlic was often used to boost immunity and prevent illness, ensuring that the warriors stayed strong and ready for the next battle. Imagine eating a hearty meal with garlic-infused bread and stew, knowing that this simple yet powerful herb was fortifying your body for whatever came next. And it wasn't just herbs. The Vikings were also skilled in making potions, some for healing, others for more mystical purposes. Cleansing potions, sleep elixirs, and even concoctions to boost strength were all part of the Vikings' post-raid recovery process. These potions were often made by mixing herbs with honey vinegar or water, creating natural remedies that could soothe sore throats, heal cuts, or calm nerves. Witchcraft and herbalism were often intertwined, with some Viking women playing the role of the healer, not just through physical remedies, but by calling on the gods for protection and guidance. Historians still argue about the degree to which Viking healing was tied to shamanistic practices. Were the remedies purely practical, or did the Vikings believe in supernatural forces? It's likely a mix of both. The Vikings' beliefs in their gods and the natural world would have influenced how they viewed healing. While they trusted the herbs, they also likely believed that their success in healing had something to do with the will of the gods. In many ways, the Vikings approached recovery with a sense of ritual and reverence. It wasn't just about getting better. It was about aligning themselves with the powers of nature and the divine. In the end, the Vikings' approach to healing was simple yet effective. They didn't need modern pharmaceuticals or complex treatments. They had their connection to nature, their herbal knowledge, and the belief that with a little patience, a little herbal medicine, and a lot of rest, they would be ready to face the next challenge. It's a reminder that sometimes the best remedies are the simplest ones. Those that come from the earth, and those that remind us to take a breath, slow down, and let nature do its work. Now that we've looked at how the Vikings relaxed with the healing power of herbs and their deep connection to nature, let's shift focus to one of the most intimate and grounding aspects of Viking life, the Viking home itself. It may seem surprising, but the Longhouse, a place where Vikings lived, ate, fought, and slept, wasn't just a functional shelter. It was a sanctuary, a refuge from the wild, chaotic world outside. After a raid or a long journey, the Longhouse provided the ultimate form of relaxation, a space where the Vikings could truly reset, leaving the violence and tension of battle at the door. The Viking Longhouse was the heart of their domestic life, and it wasn't just where they rested, it was where they reconnected with their families and found comfort in a sense of belonging. Picture yourself walking into a Viking longhouse after a brutal raid. The air is heavy with the smell of smoke from the fire that crackles in the center. The sound of laughter and chatter fills the room, and the warmth of the fire embraces you like a gentle hug. It's a place of comfort, security, and community, everything that the harsh world outside didn't offer. But more than just warmth, the longhouse was designed to encourage togetherness. The layout of the longhouse, with its long open space and rows of benches and sleeping areas, encouraged constant interaction between family members, neighbors, and fellow warriors. Historians believe that the Vikings didn't just use their homes as places to sleep. They used them as places to recharge and reconnect with the people they cared about most. The sense of togetherness, the idea that you were never alone, helped the Vikings relax in a way that isolated cabins or modern homes simply can't replicate. The central hearth wasn't just for cooking or warmth. It was a symbol of unity, a place around which families gathered to eat, share stories, and, yes, unwind. For Vikings who had spent weeks at sea or months in battle, the hearth represented home, a place where they could let their guard down and leave the warrior persona behind. It was here that they could talk about more than just their latest victory. They could share their fears, their dreams, and their hopes for the future. The hearth offered a psychological break from the brutal realities of Viking life, offering comfort in a way that no battlefield could ever match. One of the most interesting aspects of Viking homes was the emphasis on community, even in the design of the living spaces. A typical Viking longhouse had several families living under one roof, sharing the communal space. This meant that after a raid, a Viking could return to the comfort of familiar faces to the support of their loved ones. In this way, the longhouse became more than just a physical space. It was a safe haven, a retreat from the violence and tension of their daily lives. The Vikings were warriors, yes, but they were also family-oriented. And the longhouse was the foundation of that family bond. After a battle, the warmth of the fire, the company of loved ones, and the sense of belonging were what gave Vikings the strength to continue. It wasn't just the physical comforts of the home that helped them relax, it was the psychological security that came from knowing you had a place to return, to a place where your identity as a warrior could be paused, if only for a moment. Historians still debate how much Vikings valued these domestic comforts. Some argue that the Vikings, with their constant need to travel and raid, didn't spend enough time at home to truly value these comforts. But the overwhelming evidence suggests otherwise. Viking society was deeply communal, and the longhouse wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a sanctuary from the chaos of the outside world, a place where warriors could find rest in the form of familial love and companionship. But it wasn't just about the human family. Many Vikings kept animals in the longhouse, often using them for warmth and companionship. Animals like dogs and goats were commonly found in the homes of Vikings, providing a sense of comfort and company after a long, lonely journey. The presence of these animals was not only practical, it was also emotionally restorative. The Vikings, despite their fearsome reputations, had an innate connection to their animals, and the simple act of petting or tending to them could be incredibly soothing. It was another way for them to unwind after the intensity of battle. One of the most remarkable things about the Viking longhouse was its ability to serve as both a practical living space and a place of emotional recovery. It was in this space that the Vikings could leave behind their warrior persona, share meals with loved ones, and find solace in the comfort of familiarity. The Vikings understood that relaxation wasn't just about physical rest. It was about creating a space where community love and belonging could flourish. The longhouse was the ultimate symbol of Viking relaxation, a refuge from the storm, both physical and emotional, that allowed them to recharge before their next adventure. So the next time you think about the Vikings, imagine them not just as fierce warriors, but as families. Picture them returning home, tired but content, gathering around the fire to laugh, tell stories, and relax in the embrace of their homes and loved ones. In a world full of chaos and uncertainty, the Viking home was their sanctuary, a place where they could truly find peace. As we continue our journey into the Vikings' recovery practices, let's shift focus to a fascinating aspect of Viking culture that might surprise you: the rituals and ceremonies they performed to foster relaxation and balance. We've talked about their love for nature, their connection to family, and their skill in crafting. Now let's explore the Vikings' ritualistic side, which was surprisingly soothing and peaceful in contrast to their often brutal way of life. You might be thinking, wait, didn't the Vikings just raid and conquer? Sure, they were fierce warriors, but they were also deeply spiritual people, and that spirituality was woven into their everyday lives. When it came to unwinding after the intensity of battle, the Vikings had several rituals and ceremonies designed to bring a sense of peace and calm. These rituals weren't just about appeasing the gods. They were about creating inner balance and emotional well-being. One of the most common Viking rituals was the blot, a sacred ceremony that involved making offerings to the gods, usually in the form of food, drink, or even sacrifices. While the blot might sound intense, it wasn't necessarily about violence. In fact, the central idea behind these ceremonies was about gratitude and harmony. After a raid, warriors would gather around, offer thanks for their survival, and ask for protection in the future. The act of giving back to the gods helped the Vikings process the emotions they might have been holding on to after a battle. It was a way to express relief, joy, or even sorrow, while maintaining that deep connection to their spiritual beliefs. Historians still argue about the exact nature of the blot. Some suggest that it was a Thanksgiving ceremony, while others believe it was more about ensuring the gods' favor for future endeavors. Regardless of the debate, it's clear that the blot was a ritual of renewal, a time when the Vikings could spiritually reset and center themselves before the next adventure. The blot was a ritual of peace, a brief but significant moment of reflection and gratitude in the midst of their chaotic lives. In addition to the blot, there were also more intimate rituals, private moments when Vikings would offer thanks and reflection. Some warriors practiced the act of sacrifice in their own way, not always by offering animals to the gods, but by giving up personal items that were deeply significant to them. Perhaps a treasured weapon or piece of jewelry. These small personal rituals helped Vikings process the emotional toll of battle and release their stress. Giving up something precious allowed them to let go of the past and move forward. But it wasn't all about formal ceremonies. The Vikings also engaged in small personal rituals that were equally important for their relaxation and mental peace. Imagine a warrior after a hard-fought battle, sitting quietly by the fire, holding a small totem, a piece of bone or carved wood. With each turn of the carved figure, they might reflect on their past, remember the friends they'd lost, or silently pray for strength. These small rituals weren't dramatic, they were meditative. By focusing their thoughts and channeling their energies, these Vikings created a quiet space for themselves in the midst of all the noise. Historians argue whether these personal rituals were a form of personal introspection or whether they were rooted in superstition. Regardless of the reason, these moments helped the Vikings clear their minds, allowing them to release the emotional burden of battle. After all, they didn't have the luxury of modern therapy or relaxation techniques, but they had their own deeply spiritual tools for self-care. Rituals allowed them to face the violence and chaos of battle with a sense of inner calm. Rituals weren't limited to just the warriors. The Vikings had a strong sense of community that extended to their entire families. Women, too, played a central role in these ceremonies. Viking women were not only caregivers but also key figures in maintaining the spiritual harmony of the home. It wasn't uncommon for women to lead small rituals in the household, offering prayers for a good harvest or for the health of their children. These acts weren't just about asking for divine intervention. They were about creating a peaceful home and encouraging a sense of belonging within the family unit. One particular practice that stands out is the use of herbal smoke. The Vikings would burn herbs like sage and juniper in their homes to purify the air and ward off negative energy. The act of burning these herbs created a calming atmosphere, one that encouraged relaxation and inner peace. This practice is something we might associate with modern-day rituals like smudging, but the Vikings were doing it centuries ago. It was a way to clear the space and prepare the mind for rest, making it easier to fall asleep and recover after a long day. While we might think of the Vikings as a rough and tumble group of warriors, the truth is they had an incredible sense of spiritual balance that was reflected in their rituals. These ceremonies, whether large or small, formal or personal, gave the Vikings a chance to step back from the chaos of their daily lives and focus on inner peace. They understood that after a brutal raid, they needed more than just food and rest to recover. They needed to reconnect with their gods, their families, and themselves. So, when you picture the Vikings, remember that they weren't just fierce warriors. They were also deeply spiritual beings who understood the power of rituals to restore balance and relaxation. Whether it was a grand sacrifice to the gods or a quiet moment of personal reflection, these rituals were a key part of how the Vikings unwound and found peace after the intensity of battle. Just as important as their axes and shields, their rituals helped the Vikings find the strength to face whatever came next. As we continue through the Vikings' path to relaxation, let's explore another surprising yet important practice, the use of herbs and remedies. The Vikings weren't just warriors. They were deeply connected to nature, and their understanding of natural remedies was well developed. After a hard raid or a long battle, the Vikings knew that their physical and emotional recovery wasn't just about food and rest. It was about healing their bodies and minds using the natural resources around them. They knew which plants could help with ailments, which ones would calm the nerves, and which would soothe the aches from a long journey or a fierce battle. You might think of Vikings as all action all the time, but they also had a great deal of knowledge about the healing properties of herbs and plants. The Vikings used plants not just for food or drink, but for healing. After all, a warrior had to be in top physical form, especially after the stresses of battle. Some of the most common remedies included yarrow and nettle, which the Vikings used to treat wounds, reduce inflammation, and promote healing. Yarrow, in particular, was used for stopping bleeding, and it was known as a powerful herb for both physical and emotional recovery. In a time before modern medicine, the Vikings depended on their knowledge of the land to stay healthy and recover quickly from battle. Historians still argue whether the Vikings' herbal remedies were passed down through oral tradition or whether there were specific healers within the society. Some believe that the wise women or shamans were the primary sources of this knowledge, while others argue that the entire Viking population was trained to some extent in the basics of herbalism. Regardless of who was responsible for passing down this knowledge, one thing is clear: the Vikings understood the importance of healing naturally. Herbs and plants weren't just a means of recovery. They were a vital part of maintaining the health of the community as a whole. But the Vikings didn't just use herbs for physical ailments. They also understood the emotional toll that battle could take on a person. While the battles and raids were hard on the body, they were just as hard on the mind. After a raid, the Vikings knew they needed more than just sleep and food. They needed a way to deal with the mental strain and stress. Some warriors would turn to herbs like lavender and chamomile, well known for their calming properties. These herbs would have been used in teas or infusions to help ease the nervous tension that comes after the violence of a battle. Interestingly, it wasn't just the herbs that helped the Vikings relax, it was the rituals surrounding their use. The Vikings didn't just use plants and herbs casually. They had ceremonies and rituals that were specifically designed to align their body, mind, and spirit. Whether it was the preparation of an herbal remedy or the act of sitting with a hot cup of herbal tea, these moments of slowness allowed the Vikings to reset after the intensity of battle. Some historians even suggest that these herbal rituals were part of the Vikings' spiritual practices, an attempt to balance themselves not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. But let's take a closer look at how the Vikings prepared these remedies. The process was often just as important as the herb itself. There's evidence that the Vikings didn't just consume these remedies, but used them in ceremonial ways. Preparing an herbal concoction might have been a quiet, reflective practice, a way to calm the mind before heading into battle or after returning from one. Imagine yourself in the Viking longhouse sitting near the fire, grinding herbs into a mortar and pestle. The smell of the plants filling the air as you prepare your remedy. There was something about the slow pace of this activity that allowed the mind to relax. It wasn't just the physical action, it was the intention behind it. Historians debate the spirituality of these practices. Were the Vikings simply using herbs as practical remedies, or did they believe that these plants held spiritual significance? Some argue that the Vikings saw their medicinal practices as part of their connection to the gods. After all, the gods themselves were often associated with various natural elements. Thor, for example, wasn't just the god of thunder. He was also tied to fertility harvests and nature's bounty. If a Viking needed to heal from battle, they might have believed that offering thanks to Thor for his protection could play a role in their recovery. Some even theorize that Viking healers might have ritually prepared remedies, chanting prayers or blessings as they ground their herbs into powder. One of the more fascinating aspects of Viking healing was their use of sacred plants. For example, the Vikings had a special connection to mugwort, which was often used for spiritual protection and was believed to have magical properties. The Vikings didn't just use it as a remedy for physical pain. They saw it as a way to protect their souls, to keep them safe from evil spirits and negative influences. The Vikings were deeply spiritual, and many of their healing practices were wrapped in a belief system that blended the practical and the mystical. And let's not forget the power of aromatherapy. Vikings weren't just using herbs for medicinal purposes. They were also using them to soothe their minds. The use of incense from herbs like juniper and sage was common. Burning these herbs helped purify the air and cleanse the environment, creating a sense of peace in the longhouse. The Vikings didn't just heal their bodies with plants, they also used them to create a peaceful atmosphere that encouraged relaxation and emotional well-being. Imagine returning from a battle and walking into a longhouse filled with the fragrant smoke of herbs, the air thick with the scent of sage or lavender, helping you unwind from the tension of the day. It was a form of emotional healing, something we might call aromatherapy today. In the end, the Vikings' understanding of herbs and natural remedies was more than just a survival mechanism, it was a holistic approach to well-being. They used plants not just for food, but to heal their bodies, calm their minds, and even protect their souls. These remedies helped them recover from the physical toll of battle and the emotional weight of violence. For the Vikings, the healing power of nature was essential to their survival, both on the battlefield and in the longhouse. After exploring the Vikings' reliance on herbal remedies and the spiritual connection to nature, let's now look at one of the most cherished aspects of Viking relaxation: family time. Yes, the mighty Vikings, the fierce raiders and warriors who conquered much of Europe, found some of their deepest moments of peace and comfort, not in battle, but in the embrace of their loved ones. After the chaos of a raid or long travels, family was the ultimate source of emotional restoration. In the Viking world, the family unit wasn't just about maintaining bloodlines. It was about emotional security and social cohesion. Imagine this: after a successful raid, you've come back home, your muscles sore, and your mind buzzing with the events of the day. You've had your fill of mead, you've listened to the stories and songs, and the fires are burning low. Now, the most important part of the evening begins. You make your way to the part of the longhouse where your family is waiting. There's something about being with your loved ones after the tumult of battle, something grounding and deeply soothing. Your spouse is there, perhaps with children who are too young to fully understand the weight of your role as a warrior, but who still provide you with the love and security that can only come from family. In Viking society, family wasn't just a social structure. It was the core of emotional and spiritual recovery. After the physical toll of battle, the heart needed healing too. The Vikings knew this, and they dedicated time to bonding with their families, sharing moments of peace and togetherness. It wasn't just about resting physically in the safety of home, it was about emotionally connecting with the ones who truly mattered. Historians still debate how much the Viking warriors actually engaged with their children or spouses when they weren't fighting. Some argue that the warrior ethos dominated Viking life so much that the family could sometimes feel like a secondary concern. However, evidence points to the opposite. Vikings had a strong sense of family responsibility, and the emotional strength they gained from these bonds was essential for maintaining their warrior spirit. The idea that the family home was a place of rest and peace is consistent across Viking lore and archaeological findings. From the moments of bonding at the fire to the acts of care shown in times of injury or illness, the family unit was undeniably central to Viking relaxation. One key element in these family moments was the act of sharing meals. As mentioned before, after a raid, the Vikings would gather around a fire. But this wasn't just for storytelling. Meals were rituals of connection, and the time spent eating together helped to reinforce their emotional ties. In a society built on hard labor battle and risk family meals, were a time to remember what mattered most to the people around the table. Picture this bread stew, roasted meat, and perhaps some berries or dried fish from a recent catch. As you eat with your family, the cares of the world begin to fade away. You laugh, you talk, you share. Even a battle-hardened Viking couldn't help but feel a sense of peace in the simple, nourishing act of eating together. But family time wasn't always just about food. It was also about emotional support. After a raid, a warrior might return home feeling the weight of what he had witnessed. Battles weren't easy, and the emotional toll could be overwhelming. It was during these quiet moments with their families that the Vikings were able to process their feelings. A comforting word from a wife, a pat on the back from a sibling, or simply the peaceful presence of a child. These were the things that helped the warrior heal emotionally and mentally. The Viking family wasn't just there for the practicalities of daily life. It was there to provide a sense of grounding and a sense of peace that was vital to the warrior's recovery. It wasn't just the close family that played a role in this emotional recovery, though. Vikings also had a deep respect for extended family, such as uncles, aunts, and even distant cousins. The bonds between these extended family members were often just as strong as those between immediate family, and the Longhouse was a hub where family members from all over would come together to share stories, offer advice, and provide emotional comfort. This close-knit structure allowed for greater emotional security, especially after difficult raids or personal losses. It's also worth noting that women played a vital role in this aspect of relaxation. While they were not the ones going on raids, Viking women were the backbone of family life. Many historians argue that the Viking warriors' ability to unwind after a raid came largely from their wives and partners, who provided a calming, supportive presence. These women were the ones managing the home, ensuring food was prepared, and sometimes even providing healing and comfort. Their role wasn't just about maintaining the household. It was about creating a safe space where the warriors could recover and find peace. So let's think about this. When the Vikings went off to battle, they weren't just fighting for land glory or treasure. They were fighting to protect the family they loved, the home they cherished. And when they returned, the family wasn't just a place to rest their heads. It was where they could emotionally recharge, bond, and find solace after the violence of the battlefield. The role of family in Viking life was central to their ability to recover and relax. Whether it was a quiet moment with a spouse or the shared joy of a family meal, family time was where the Vikings found the peace they so desperately needed after a raid. Historians still argue about how much time Vikings actually spent with their families during times of peace, especially given their constant need to travel and fight. But one thing is clear: when they did have those quiet moments, family was their anchor, the place where they could truly unwind. As we continue to explore the ways Vikings found peace after their raids, we come to another fascinating aspect of their relaxation: the role of spiritual reflection and the deeper connection they had with the divine. After a long, brutal raid, it wasn't just the physical exhaustion and the camaraderie of family that provided relief. It was also the Vikings' relationship with the gods. The Viking worldview was deeply spiritual, and they believed that divine favor was essential not only for success in battle, but also for mental peace and emotional healing. After the chaos of a raid, the Vikings would often turn to their gods for guidance, protection, and strength. The act of reflecting on their spiritual journey was a way to center themselves and come to terms with the violence they had witnessed. It wasn't uncommon for a Viking to offer thanks to the gods for their survival, or to seek guidance for the future. This wasn't about praying for good fortune in a superficial sense. It was about aligning oneself with divine will. The Vikings understood that their actions in battle were often beyond their control, and that to maintain peace of mind, they needed to surrender to the gods' guidance. Historians still argue whether the Vikings truly saw their battles as part of a divine plan, or whether it was simply a way to rationalize their actions. Some scholars suggest that the Vikings' belief in the gods helped them cope with the violence of their lives. By offering their blood, their spoils, or their thoughts to the gods, they could cleanse themselves of the negative emotions associated with battle. Others believe that this practice was more of a ritualistic catharsis, a way to purge themselves of the trauma through spiritual release. The act of spiritual reflection for the Vikings often involved sacrifices, not necessarily grand ceremonies, but small personal gestures of gratitude and connection to the divine. It was common for Vikings to offer up a piece of food, a drink of mead, or even a token from the spoils of a raid as a way of thanking the gods. This was part of a ritual designed to restore balance. These personal acts of devotion weren't just about appeasing the gods. They were ways to reconcile the emotional toll of the violence and chaos of war. In addition to small offerings, the Vikings also engaged in prayers either alone or as a community. It wasn't uncommon for a warrior to pause after a raid, kneeling to whisper a prayer to Thor, the god of thunder, or to Freya, the goddess of love and war. These moments of spiritual quietude were essential for mental recovery. They allowed the Vikings to reflect on their actions, to give thanks for the lives they still had, and to ask for protection as they prepared for their next adventure. Just as a warrior would clean his sword after battle, he would cleanse his soul through prayer, ensuring that the emotions of battle didn't fester. But spiritual reflection wasn't just about the gods. It was also about honoring the ancestors. The Vikings revered their forebears, and in times of peace they would reflect on the deeds of those who came before them. Many warriors would perform rituals to honor their ancestors, believing that by doing so, they could draw strength from their ancient lineage. This wasn't just about celebrating past victories. It was a way to connect with their heritage, to remind themselves of the values and principles that had guided their people through the centuries. The Viking warrior wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the legacy of his ancestors, and that sense of continuity provided him with strength in the aftermath of battle. Historians argue about the exact nature of these ancestor rituals. Some believe that they were simple acts of remembrance, while others suggest that they were deeply tied to the Vikings' understanding of fate and the continuity of life. Whether it was a simple toast to the ancestors or a more elaborate ceremonial offering, these rituals helped Vikings put their own actions into perspective. They were reminded that they were part of something much larger than themselves, a grand cycle that stretched back through the ages. Interestingly, these acts of spiritual reflection and ancestor worship were not just a means of coping with the violence of war. They were also an expression of gratitude and humility. The Vikings understood that their victories weren't just about their own strength or skill. They were gifts from the gods and the ancestors. By recognizing this, they could maintain a sense of peace within themselves even after the bloodshed and chaos of battle. It was a humbling practice that kept the Vikings grounded and reminded them of their place within the cosmic order. The Vikings also had a strong sense of fate. Many of them believed that their lives were already written out for them by the gods, and that what happened on the battlefield was part of a larger plan. This belief in fate helped them to come to terms with the unpredictability of their lives. It gave them the confidence to face battle, knowing that whatever happened was part of a greater design. After a raid, this belief in fate helped the Vikings put aside any guilt or confusion. They knew that they were simply playing their part in the grand story of the world. So, while the Vikings were undoubtedly fierce warriors, their spirituality played a significant role in how they recharged and relaxed after a raid. Through small personal offerings, prayers, and ancestor rituals, they maintained a sense of balance and connection to something larger than themselves. These spiritual practices helped them process the emotions of battle and keep their minds calm and focused for the next challenge. The act of reflecting on their spiritual and ancestral connections was a profound way of ensuring that their warrior spirit remained strong and resilient. As we wrap up our journey into the relaxation practices of the Vikings, let's take a final look at one of their most underrated sources of peace: personal reflection and introspection. In the midst of all the physical exertion, social connection, and spiritual rituals, the Vikings knew the importance of taking a moment to simply reflect on their lives and their experiences. This wasn't about retreating into silence for days on end or losing themselves in deep meditation. It was more about finding quiet moments of clarity and peace amidst their otherwise chaotic existence. Picture this: you've just returned from a raid, your body aching and your mind racing with the adrenaline of battle. The fire's still crackling in the background, the meat is flowing, and your fellow warriors are chatting away. But you've decided to take a quiet moment to sit at the edge of the longhouse far enough to hear the conversations, but close enough to feel the warmth of the fire. It's in this personal space, a space of quiet contemplation, that you reflect on the day's events. The Vikings, despite their warrior-like tendencies, understood the value of pause. They didn't just rush from one fight to the next without considering the emotional toll it took. Personal reflection was a crucial part of how they managed the trauma of battle. Historians often debate how much the Vikings themselves understood the need for emotional processing, but evidence suggests that many of them took time to reflect on their actions and experiences, even if only briefly. This isn't just about getting away from it all. It's about acknowledging the things that made them feel vulnerable, the losses they experienced, and the questions they had about their roles in the world. The Viking practice of reflection wasn't just an afterthought. In fact, it was deeply embedded in their social structures and personal routines. Many warriors would engage in a form of self-examination after a raid, mentally reviewing what went well, what went wrong, and what they could learn for the future. This wasn't just about dwelling on their mistakes or celebrating their victories, it was about understanding and improving. These moments of reflection likely helped them come to terms with the chaos of their lives and gave them the strength to continue. For many, this reflective pause was the peaceful counterpart to the intensity of battle. Historians argue whether this was an individual process or if it was shared within the Viking community. Some suggest that it was primarily an individual activity, a moment of quiet isolation, while others believe that reflection often took place in the company of friends or mentors as a way of sharing insights and guiding each other through their emotional struggles. Either way, it's clear that reflection was a vital part of the Vikings' ability to relax and reset after the intensity of riding. One of the more fascinating elements of Viking introspection was their belief in personal fate. Many Vikings believed that their lives were shaped by a divine force or higher power, whether it was the gods themselves or the fates. This belief in destiny gave them an unusual sense of peace, even after a brutal raid. They could look back and accept the outcome knowing that their path had been preordained. There was something profoundly comforting in the idea that no matter what happened, their life was unfolding according to a larger cosmic plan. This sense of purpose and acceptance helped them maintain their calm in the face of adversity. But reflection wasn't always a solemn practice. Sometimes it took the form of light-hearted storytelling or laughing at themselves. When a Viking returned from a raid, he might joke about his clumsiness during battle, or recount an exaggerated story of how he had outsmarted a seemingly impossible foe. The Vikings loved self-deprecating humor, and this too was a way of processing their experiences. By laughing at themselves and sharing stories with others, they could release the intensity of battle and find joy in the small moments of life. It was a reminder that they weren't just defined by their strength and valor, they were also human, capable of finding humor in the absurdity of life. Another practice linked to reflection was the nightly ritual of the warrior's rest. Before heading to bed, many Vikings would mentally recount the day's events, whether it was the success of the raid or the struggles they faced in battle. This moment of quiet reflection was often done alone, but sometimes shared with a trusted companion. It was their way of processing everything they had gone through, helping them to let go of any residual stress or anxiety before heading to sleep. This mental clearing allowed them to sleep more soundly and be ready for whatever the next day held in store. Historians still debate how much time Vikings spent reflecting or contemplating their actions after battle. Were they constantly haunted by what they had seen or done, or did they have ways of simply moving on? Some scholars suggest that the Vikings, with their belief in fate and the gods, were able to mentally move forward quickly, leaving the past behind. Others believe they had to find ways to heal emotionally, just like any other warrior in history. Whatever the case, the Vikings had personal reflection built into their cultural practices, and this process of emotional cleansing was just as important as the physical rest they got after a raid. In the end, personal reflection was a vital part of how the Vikings relaxed after the intensity of battle. Whether it was sitting quietly alone, sharing a story with friends, or mentally reviewing the day's events, These moments of introspection were crucial for maintaining balance in a life full of chaos and violence. It was these moments of reflection, coupled with their connection to family nature and the divine, that allowed the Vikings to truly unwind and recharge for whatever came next. And so, as the fires dimmed and the longhouse grew quiet, the Viking warriors would rest, not just their bodies, but their minds. And in that space between the echoes of battle and the stillness of the night, they would find the peace they so desperately needed.